The Mafia boss found his poor Maid in an abandoned frozen warehouse. He was too late. Some mistakes cost money. Malachi Drago's cost him the only person in that house who had never once asked him for anything. The steel door of Warehouse 7 groaned as he drove his shoulder against it for the third time. Rusted hinges cracked like dry bone, and the padlock finally surrendered to the concrete floor with a hollow echo that dissolved into the darkness inside. The damp cold rising from the room smelled of metal and forgotten years, and for the first time in his life, Malachi Drago was afraid to take another step. In Baltimore, people lowered their voices when they said the name Drago. They believed he controlled the entire waterfront from behind polished tables and quiet conversations that never needed to become threats. They believed nothing happened in that city without his permission. They were wrong. 4 days earlier, a woman had walked out through his front gate at 4:17 in the morning, and he had believed the worst about her. The flashlight trembled in his hand as its beam cut through the dark. Then the light stopped moving. She was sitting against the far wall, wrists still bound, her head resting against the concrete as if exhaustion had finally won the argument. She had been fighting alone. Malachi crossed the room faster than he had moved in years and dropped to his knees beside her. Ruthie. Her name left his lips as a whisper instead of an order. She had lived in his house for 3 years, and that was the first time he had ever spoken it. Her skin was cold. A faint breath escaped her lips, so weak he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. Relief hit him so hard it hurt, and it lasted exactly 1 heartbeat. Because when the doctor knelt beside her, she did not say the girl would be fine. She said if they had reached her 1 day sooner, everything would have been different. 1 day. 26 ordinary hours, while he sat in boardrooms, telling himself his housekeeper was a thief. But what he found in that room was not a thief, and the safe she had taken that night, it had never been opened. If this story touched you, leave a like so we know you're listening. Share it with someone you think needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the stories still to come. 4 days before that night, the house in Roland Park still ran as smoothly as a machine no one had ever thought to ask who kept it oiled. Ruthie Pell was always there at 5 o'clock in the morning. She entered the kitchen before the city had even begun to light up, her left foot moving a little more slowly than her right, a small, uneven rhythm she had learned to hide many years ago. She turned on the kitchen light but left the hallway dark because Malachi Drago hated harsh light before 6 o'clock. She heated the water. She roasted the coffee beans again from the previous afternoon because he drank only coffee roasted within the past 24 hours, a habit he had never spoken aloud, but one she had noticed during her first winter there. She poured the coffee into his cup, waited exactly 4 minutes for it to cool to the temperature he preferred, then placed it at the corner of the dining table, on his right side, exactly 1 hand's breadth from the edge. Beside the coffee sat a glass of water and a pill for his stomach. He had never asked why the pill was always there. He had also never asked why his coat had been hanging from the stair post instead of inside the closet, ever since the morning he arrived 15 minutes late to a meeting simply because he couldn't find it. At 6:15, Malachi came down the stairs. He was tall and broad. His steps made no sound, and in this city, people lowered their voices whenever they spoke his family name. He passed Ruthie the way he passed the wooden table, the lamp, or the painting on the wall whose place of purchase he had long forgotten. She stepped back half a pace to clear his path, exactly as she had done every morning for 3 years. He lifted the coffee, took 1 sip, and set it down. He didn't look at her. In 3 years inside that house, Ruthie had heard him speak the names of hundreds of people, the names of lawyers, the names of captains, the names of those who owed him and those he owed. He remembered perfectly the name of a harbor foreman's daughter whom he had met only twice. But when he needed Ruthie, he spoke to August Fenn, and Fenn passed the instruction on to her. On the rare occasions when Malachi addressed her directly, he used only 2 words. That girl. That girl, bring me the file on the desk. That girl, close the window. Ruthie had never corrected him. She had never let him see that she noticed. Some people were born into a world where being called by the right name was taken for granted, while others grew up inside a system where their names were nothing more than a line written on a file passed from one house to another. She belonged to the second kind, and she had stopped expecting anything else a long time ago. August Fenn was the man who managed everything above her. He had served the Drago family for 30 years, carried the keys to every door in the mansion, and had a habit of checking each task by reading it aloud before crossing it out in pencil. That morning, he stood in the kitchen doorway and read Ruthie's list as he always did, then added one final instruction. From now on, you don't need to clean the 3rd floor. Ruthie looked up. The 3rd floor was where the records room was located. Who will clean it, sir? That's none of your concern. He folded the list, slipped it into his coat pocket, and walked away before she could ask anything more. Ruthie remained standing for a moment in the empty kitchen, the cleaning cloth still in her hand. For 3 years, she had cleaned the 3rd floor every Tuesday and Friday morning. Not because anyone had told her to, but because it was part of the work. And over those 3 years, she had learned something no one in that house had imagined a maid could ever understand. When people began hiding a room from you, it was usually because something inside it frightened them enough that they couldn't risk letting you see it. She had seen it 3 weeks earlier. Ruthie worked through that morning exactly as she did every other day. She changed the tablecloths, polished the stair railing, and watered the small potted plant on the windowsill of her room in the east basement. But every few dozen minutes, she lifted her eyes toward the hallway leading to Malachi's study, where the oak door always stood slightly open, and the sound of his voice carried steadily into the corridor as he spoke on the telephone, calm and even, never once raised. Near noon, she washed her hands carefully, removed her apron, and smoothed the front of her dress. She walked down the hallway, counting each step as though she were counting the beats of her own heart. Then she stopped before that door. Inside, his voice remained measured and unhurried. He was discussing some shipment. The numbers were so large that they had lost all meaning to someone who counted every dollar to pay for her younger brother's dialysis treatments. Ruthie raised her hand. Her fingers, roughened by years of cleaning chemicals, touched the brass doorknob, cold and smooth beneath her skin. She held it there for a stretch of time she would never later be able to measure. She had rehearsed the sentence in her mind for 3 weeks. "Sir, there's something I need to show you." Then she imagined him looking up and not knowing who she was. She thought of those 2 words, that girl. Ruthie released the doorknob, turned away, and walked back toward the stairs. Behind her, the door remained slightly open, exactly as it had been before, as though no one had ever stood there at all. That afternoon, Saul Briggs arrived at the estate without calling ahead, and that was the first sign that something was wrong. Saul had walked beside Malachi Drago for 12 years, a 45-year-old man with a habit of delivering bad news in such a calm voice that it took the listener several seconds to understand how serious it truly was. He entered the study, closed the door behind him, and said that the port police had been holding the shipment at Pier 9 since morning. Malachi didn't look up at once. He finished signing the page in front of him, set down his pen, and only then asked why it had been held. "There's a discrepancy in the documents. They say the declared weight doesn't match the bill of lading." "Who prepared the documents?" "Marisol." Malachi nodded, and the matter ended there. Marisol Vega had served as chief accountant for Drago Maritime for 7 years. She was the woman who made coffee for him during long nights at the office before he was old enough for anyone to call him the boss. She was the only person in the organization permitted to correct his signature on official papers without asking first. If there was an error in the documents, then it was an error, and nothing more. In the life of a man who worked in maritime shipping, vessels were held over paperwork as often as April rain fell over Baltimore. Anything else? Saul stood silent for a moment. "Coslow's men have been to Pier 4 twice this week. They didn't do anything. They just stood there and watched." Yuri Koslow was 60 years old and had wanted the southern shipping route since before Malachi inherited control. That was nothing new. What was new was the fact that his men had stood there watching without making a move. In their world, silence always cost more than noise. "Put more men at Pier 4 and Pier 9. Don't let anyone see that we've increased security." Saul left. Malachi remained alone until darkness fell, and that was why it was nearly 7 o'clock in the evening before he finally stepped out of the study. Ruthie was standing in the hallway. She wasn't pretending to clean anything. She held no cloth and carried no tray. She simply stood there with both hands clasped in front of her stomach, and the moment he came through the doorway, she spoke quickly, like someone who had rehearsed the words again and again, and feared that 1 second of hesitation would strip away all her courage. "Sir, someone asked me about you." Malachi stopped. He looked at her, and for one very brief moment, he truly saw her. "What did he ask?" "About your car. What time you usually leave the house, which vehicle you take, whether you travel the same route every day." She drew in a breath. "And the wine cellar. He asked whether the cellar was locked and whether anyone ever went down there." "Who asked?" "I don't know his name. A man. He said he worked for the heating maintenance company." She paused. But the heating system was serviced in March, sir. Malachi had heard enough warnings in his life to know which ones deserved his attention. And he had heard this one. He simply hadn't heard what lay beneath it. Tell Fen. I already did. 4 words. She spoke those 4 words without changing her tone, but she didn't turn away. She remained where she was, her hands still clasped in front of her stomach, her eyes still fixed on him. It was everything a maid could do to say that Fen was the problem. It was everything a woman without a name in that house dared to do. Had Malachi Drago asked one more question then, only one, he wouldn't have had to kick through an iron door at the harbor 4 days later. But he was thinking about the shipment at Pier 9. He was thinking about the men who had been watching at Pier 4. Then let Fen handle it. He walked past her. Ruthie remained standing in the dark hallway, and she didn't move until the sound of his footsteps had completely faded at the top of the stairs. Then she went down to the kitchen, washed cups that were already clean, and rearranged towels that had already been folded. Her hands worked while her mind calculated. 3 weeks earlier, she had seen August Fen open the back door at 2 o'clock in the morning for 2 men she had never seen before. She had reported it. Fen told her she had been mistaken. 2 weeks earlier, she saw it happen again. She reported it again. Fen told her that if she spoke of it to anyone else, she would lose her job the very next day, and he said it with a polite smile, while still holding the pencil he used to cross tasks from his list. Ruthie needed that job. 3 dialysis treatments every week for Benny cost more than she earned, and she had learned to survive by subtracting everything from her life that wasn't absolutely necessary. She had no one to call. She had nowhere to go. So when Fen told her that morning that she no longer needed to clean the 3rd floor, she understood that her time was running out. And that night, after the sound of Malachi Drago's footsteps had disappeared on the stairs, Ruthie Pell dried her hands, turned off the kitchen light, and decided that if no one in that house was willing to listen to her, then she would find something herself that no one could claim she had imagined. That night, Malachi Drago worked later than usual. The light in his study was still burning after the rest of the house had gone dark. And spread across the desk before him were 3 files concerning the shipment being held at Pier 9, each containing a different declaration, none of them matching the others completely. He had read them 3 times. He still couldn't find the error, and what troubled him wasn't the numbers, but the feeling that someone had stood there before him and known exactly which order he would choose to read them in. Near midnight, there came a very soft knock at the door, 2 taps, separated by precisely 1 beat. She always knocked that way. Ruthie entered, carrying a tray of tea. She placed it at the corner of the desk, on his right side, exactly 1 hand's breadth from the edge, just as she placed his coffee every morning. I didn't ask for tea. No, sir. She offered no explanation. She didn't leave either. Malachi looked up, for the 2nd time that day, and saw that she was still standing there with 1 hand resting on the edge of the tray. What is it? You've been sitting at this desk for 15 hours, sir. Malachi looked at the clock on the wall, then back at her. He couldn't remember what time he had sat down, but she could. Have you been counting? I brought your coffee in at 9 o'clock this morning. You were sitting in that exact same place. There was something deeply strange about that moment, something Malachi wouldn't have the courage to name until many months later. 7 people worked in his house. Beyond those walls, nearly 200 people depended on the ships that carried his name. Not one of them had ever counted the hours he spent sitting at a desk. That sounds like an order. It's only a cup of tea, sir. He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not enough to be called a smile, but enough to startle him. He lifted the teacup. It was warm enough to drink immediately, with no need to wait. The morning coffee, he said. Why is it always cool enough to drink? Ruthie hesitated. It was the first question he had asked about her work in 3 years. Because you take the first sip before you read your mail. If it's too hot, you set it down and forget about it. Malachi said nothing. He looked at her a little longer. The woman standing before him was small, with brown hair tied low at the nape of her neck and 2 hands reddened by cleaning chemicals. And he suddenly realized that he didn't know how old she was. He didn't know where she came from. He didn't know who had hired her. And he didn't know why she was standing there at midnight telling him that he ought to sleep. He had the chance to ask. The telephone on his desk began to vibrate. Saul Briggs's name appeared on the screen. Malachi reached for it, and in the moment he lowered his eyes toward the display. That very brief moment, Ruthie stepped back half a pace as she always did. "Good night, Mr. Drago," He didn't look up. All right. She left, closing the door very softly behind her, and the uneven rhythm of her footsteps slowly faded along the wooden hallway. Malachi answered the call. Saul reported that the shipment at Pier 9 was still being held, and that the port police had requested copies of every document from the previous 6 months. The call lasted 11 minutes. By the time he set the telephone down, the tea had gone completely cold, and he finished it in 2 swallows without tasting a thing. Those were the last words he spoke to Ruthie Pell before everything came crashing down. And later, while lying awake through long nights in hospital corridors, he would remember that answer. All right, 2 words. He had answered her with only 2 words. Ruthie, however, didn't go to sleep. She went down to the east basement, entered her small room, and sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness. On the windowsill, her little potted plant caught a faint wash of light from the street lamp outside. On the table sat the tin box that held Benny's bills, and she had memorized every number inside it so completely that she didn't need to open the lid to remember them. She sat there for a very long time. She thought about remaining silent. She could continue polishing the stair rail, placing the pill beside the glass of water, closing the windows before the rain, and pretending she had never seen anything on the 3rd floor. No one in the world would blame her. People didn't demand courage from those who had nothing to lose, because those who had nothing to lose were often the ones who lost the most when they failed. Then she thought of the man sitting alone beneath that lamp, reading 3 files he didn't know had been arranged especially for him. Ruthie stood up. The clock on the kitchen wall read 4:17 in the morning when the gates of the Drago estate opened. The following morning, Malachi Drago came down the stairs at 6:15 and stepped into a house that had stopped functioning without warning. The hallway lights were burning harshly, the kind of light he hated. The dining table was empty. There was no cup of coffee at the corner on his right, no glass of water, no pill. His coat was still inside the closet, neatly folded, exactly where someone who knew nothing about him would have left it. He stopped in the middle of the kitchen for about 3 seconds, and during those 3 seconds, no clear thought came to him. There was only a small feeling of emptiness that he brushed aside at once, the way a man might brush a speck of dust from his sleeve. August Fenn appeared in the kitchen doorway, with the task list in his hand and an expression that had been carefully prepared. "Sir, the maid is gone." "Gone where?" "Gone for good, sir. Her room is empty. I had someone check it this morning." Fenn paused for exactly the right amount of time. "And there is something I'm obliged to report to you." Malachi hadn't had anything to drink. He went straight to the study, and he saw it before Fenn could even finish the sentence. The portable safe that had stood inside the wall recess behind the filing cabinet door, a gray steel box weighing about 15 kilograms that he hadn't opened in years, was no longer there. Where it had once sat was a clean rectangle in the dust. He couldn't remember what was inside it. That was the truth he would later be forced to speak aloud before a federal attorney, and it would shame him more deeply than any accusation. The safe had belonged to his father. Since Malachi took control, every financial document belonging to Drago Maritime had been managed by Marisol Vega, and she had suggested storing the important originals in the safe at his private residence, instead of at the office, because the office was always the first place people searched. It had been a reasonable suggestion. He had agreed 7 years earlier, and hadn't opened the safe even once to see what she had placed inside it. The security room was on the ground floor. Saul Briggs arrived within 20 minutes and rewound the footage himself. 4:17 in the morning. On the black and white screen, Ruthie Pell emerged through the side door and walked along the gravel path alone. No one followed her. No one walked ahead of her. She didn't run. She didn't look around. She moved with the familiar, uneven rhythm of her left leg, slower than usual because both arms were wrapped around the gray safe, pressed against her chest. She stopped at the gate, lowered the safe to the ground, entered the code to open the gate, lifted the safe again, and stepped outside. There was no hand on her shoulder. No vehicle waited within the frame. Saul rewound the recording. They watched it a second time, then a third. "She knew the gate code," Saul said. "Every member of the household staff knows the gate code." "She knew where the safe was." Malachi didn't answer that. He stood staring at the frozen screen, the final image fixed on the gate that had just closed, and inside his mind, something was beginning to arrange itself into an order he would later understand had been completely wrong. 3 years. A woman he had never asked a single question. A woman who had stood in the dark hallway on 2 consecutive nights, asking him about his cars, his schedule, and whether the wine cellar was locked. That woman had taken his key and walked out at 4:17 in the morning. In Malachi Drago's world, there weren't many ways to interpret a recording like that. Fen stood in the doorway of the security room, with both hands clasped behind his back, his voice carrying just the proper amount of regret. "I've suspected her for several weeks, sir. She had a habit of wandering around the 3rd floor. I forbade her from going up there. I should have reported it to you sooner." Malachi heard the words, and they fit. That was the worst part. Every piece fit, and no one in that room asked why they fit together so neatly. Marisol Vega called at 7 o'clock. She had heard the news from Fen. Her voice was calm and warm, exactly as it had been for the past 7 years. "Were any important documents taken?" "I don't know what was inside." "Then let me check the inventory. Don't worry about the accounting records." Saul waited until the call had ended before speaking, and he used the same calm voice that hadn't changed in 12 years. "Give me 2 days. She's on foot, she walks with a limp, and she's carrying a safe that weighs 15 kilograms. She can't have gone far. I'll find her, and I'll handle it according to the family's way." A long silence settled over the room. Malachi Drago had lost many things in his life. Money was the easiest thing to lose, and the easiest thing to recover. Whatever had been inside that safe might have been contracts, might have been ledgers, or might have been nothing at all. That wasn't what made him clench his jaw until the scar along the left side of his jawbone pulled tight. It was the knowledge that for 3 years, someone had lived beneath his roof, knew how he took his coffee, knew where he forgot his coat, knew how many hours he had spent sitting at his desk. And that person, it turned out, had only been counting too. He nodded. Later, whenever people asked Malachi Drago what he had done during those 26 hours, he always gave the same answer. "I worked." It was the most honest answer he could offer. And also the one that made him feel most disgusted with himself. Because while a woman lay in darkness inside Warehouse 7, he had sat in conference rooms and signed documents, as he did on any other day. At 9 o'clock that morning, the attorney for Drago Maritime arrived at the Fells Point office without calling ahead. And that too was a warning, much like Saul's arrival at the estate the previous afternoon. He spread 3 pages across the desk and said that federal authorities were seeking a warrant to search the company's complete financial records from the previous 4 years. It was no longer the port police. It was no longer merely about the shipment at Pier 9. That shipment had only been the door, and someone had pushed it open. What are they looking for? They haven't said. But their warrant application mentions 4 accounts. All 4 are in your name. Malachi read the names of the 4 accounts. He recognized 2 of them. The other 2 were accounts he had never seen in his life. "I didn't open these 2 accounts." The attorney looked at him for a long time, with the expression every lawyer gave a client who had just said something that made no sense. "The signatures on the account opening documents are yours, sir. I compared them myself." Malachi remained alone after the attorney left. Inside his mind, everything was still arranged in a clear and orderly pattern. Someone was moving against him. Coslow wanted the southern route, and the cheapest way to seize a shipping route wasn't to spill blood at the harbor, but to let the federal government do the work instead. Coslow's men had been standing watch at Pier 4. A stranger had come to the estate asking about his vehicles and his schedule, and a maid had carried his safe through the gate at 4:17 in the morning. Every piece still fit. At noon, Marisol Vega entered his office, carrying 2 cups of coffee and an inventory file. She was 41 years old, her hair tied neatly back, and she had stood in that room more often than anyone except Saul. She placed 1 cup in front of him, exactly as she had done during those long nights 12 years earlier, when he still hadn't been old enough for people to call him the boss. "I reviewed the entire inventory," she said. The safe contained the original leases for 3 piers, old vessel registration papers, and several financial records from your father's time. Nothing you can't replace. "Are there copies?" "Of course. I keep copies of everything." She sat down, opened the inventory file, and spoke with the gentle voice of someone carefully loosening a tangled thread. "But if the federal authorities come in, they'll ask why the originals are missing. Don't worry about that part. Let me handle the accounting records. Your job is to keep the harbor quiet for the next 2 weeks." Malachi nodded. He nodded twice during those 26 hours, and both times he was wrong. The afternoon passed in a series of telephone calls. He spoke with 2 ship owners, a city councilman, and the head of the dockworkers' union. He did everything a man in his position was expected to do when the ground beneath him began to shift. No one saw anything unusual in him, because there was nothing unusual to see. Malachi Drago never raised his voice. People feared him precisely because of that silence. At 7 o'clock that evening, Saul called. "A car has been parked at the end of Blackthorn Street for 3 nights in a row. About 200 meters from your gate. False license plates. 3 nights? Since before she left." Malachi remained silent on the line for a long time. Since before she left. He took in that information and placed it beside the other pieces. And it still fit, because once people had chosen a story, every new detail automatically found a place within it. A thief always had an accomplice waiting outside. He returned to the estate shortly before 11 o'clock that night. The house was silent in a way he couldn't name. He stood at the foot of the stairs for a long while, his keys still in his hand, trying to understand where the feeling came from. It wasn't the absence of sound, because the house had always been quiet. It was something else beneath that quiet, like a person who had listened to a clock ticking in the same room for years and only became aware of its existence on the night it stopped. He went up to his study. He worked for another 3 hours beneath that lamp. There was no knock at the door. 2 soft taps, separated by precisely 1 beat. There was no tray of tea placed at the corner of the desk on his right. At around 2 o'clock in the morning, Malachi Drago lifted his head from the file, looked toward the closed door, and for a moment so brief that he almost failed to recognize it. He waited. Then he lowered his eyes and returned to his work, telling himself the same thing he would repeat many times throughout the following day, the short and convenient sentence that allowed him to remain seated while time ran out in a place 9 kilometers away. She was a thief. Inside Warehouse 7, the clock was still running. The call came at 9:40 the following evening, and Saul Briggs wouldn't speak over the telephone. He only told Malachi where he was standing and said that he needed to come. The alley lay behind a laundromat on Kilbourne Street, exactly 4 blocks from the gates of the Drago estate. 4 blocks. A healthy person could walk the distance in 9 minutes. Someone with a limp, carrying 15 kilograms of steel against her chest, might have needed 20. When Malachi stepped out of the car, 2 of Saul's men were standing at opposite ends of the alley, and a metal trash container had been pulled into the middle of the passage. The gray safe rested on the wet concrete beneath the only streetlight, surrounded by several garbage bags that had been cut open. "It was at the bottom," Saul said, "covered beneath 4 layers of bags. Someone wanted to keep it out of sight, but they didn't want it to disappear." Malachi said nothing. He walked over, crouched beside the safe, and stared at it for a long time. The steel casing was intact. There wasn't a single cut or chisel mark. None of the 4 corners was dented. The mechanical lock on the front remained exactly as it had been, its brass face dull with age, unscratched and untouched by any tool. "Has anyone tried to open it?" "No one has touched it except to pull it out." Malachi reached out and placed his fingers against the lock. The metal was cold and damp. In the 12 years he had led the Drago family, he had seen every kind of thief. Those who stole because they needed money, sold what they took before the night was over. Those who stole out of hatred destroyed their prize. Those who stole to fulfill an order, delivered the goods, and vanished from the eastern seaboard. He had never met, and had never even heard of, a thief who carried the spoils through the night for 20 minutes on foot, then threw them into a trash container behind a laundromat, untouched, intact, and never once opened. The question came to him very slowly, and when it did, it overturned everything that had happened during the previous 2 days, as completely as someone turning over a wooden board. If she had stolen this safe, why hadn't she opened it? And if she had never intended to open it, why had she taken it at all? "Put it in the car." They opened the safe in the study at the estate shortly before 11 o'clock that night. Malachi had kept the mechanical key in his desk drawer since the day his father died, and it took him some time even to remember where it was, which in itself said everything. The lock turned smoothly. The lid opened. Inside were 4 neatly arranged files, the original pier leases, exactly as Marisol had said. The old registration papers for 3 ships that had been sold long ago, a thick financial file from his father's time, its pages yellowed with age, and at the very bottom, sealed separately inside a plastic envelope, were 2 things Marisol Vega hadn't mentioned at all in the inventory she had read to him the day before. The first was a file containing account opening documents. Malachi flipped through it quickly. 4 accounts. 2 he knew, and 2 he had never seen in his life. The same 4 names his attorney had read to him the previous morning. His signature appeared on every page. He lifted one of the documents, held it beneath the desk lamp, and studied the pen strokes carefully. It was very close. So close that had someone placed it before him in a stack of papers at the end of a 15-hour workday, he would have signed the next page without giving it another thought. But he looked at the final curve in the name Drago, a stroke he had written tens of thousands of times in his life, and where he never once lifted the pen. On this page, whoever had written it had lifted the pen. The second item was a small black portable hard drive, no larger than a pack of cigarettes, with no label. Saul connected it to the computer. A single folder appeared on the screen, and when he clicked on it, an empty field opened and demanded a password. They tried the date of Malachi's father's birth. They tried the registration number of the first ship the Drago family had ever owned. They tried the company name, the year it was founded, and the 4 number sequences Marisol regularly used for the accounting system. Wrong. 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 After the 6th attempt, Saul stopped and looked up. This doesn't belong to you, does it? No. Then who created the password? Malachi didn't answer. He rose, walked to the window, and looked down at the gravel path leading toward the gates, the same path a woman had crossed 2 nights earlier with that safe in her arms. He thought about the 4 blocks. He thought about the fact that she hadn't opened the safe. He thought about the car with false license plates that had been parked at the end of Blackthorn Street for 3 nights, since before she left, and this time, that detail no longer fit the old story. It belonged to an entirely different one, a story in which someone had been watching his gates beforehand, and a small woman with a limp had carried the safe out at 4:17 in the morning, not to sell it, but to remove it from the house. Then, somewhere along the way, she had realized that someone was behind her, and she had done the only thing she could still do. She had hidden it somewhere close enough for his men to find, yet concealed enough that whoever was following her wouldn't. Then she had kept walking, alone, carrying nothing at all. Malachi Drago turned away from the window, and his voice was slightly rougher than usual, just enough for Saul Briggs to notice and never mention it again. Forget everything else. Stop looking for the safe. Then what are we looking for? Find her. The clock on the wall read 11:18 at night. Ruthie Pell had been in the darkness for 43 hours. Malachi Drago had lived in the house in Roland Park for 12 years and had never once gone down to the east basement. He knew it existed in the same way people knew the foundation beneath a house existed. A narrow staircase behind the kitchen descended 14 steps into a low-ceilinged corridor with 4 white-painted wooden doors. That night, after Saul had left, Malachi took a lamp and went down alone. The first 3 doors opened into storage rooms. The 4th was unlocked. He stood at the threshold for a long time before stepping inside, and as he waited there, he suddenly realized something so small that it was almost absurd. He didn't know whose room he was standing before. He was only guessing because the other 3 rooms were filled with cardboard boxes. The room measured about 9 square meters. A single bed stood against the wall, its sheets pulled so smooth that there wasn't a single wrinkle, the corners folded neatly and squarely like those in a hospital. There was a small wooden table, 1 chair, a narrow wardrobe. On the windowsill at ground level, catching the yellow light that spilled down from the street lamp beside the gravel path outside, sat a small plant growing in an old tin can, its leaves green and the soil still damp. Someone had watered it before leaving. Malachi opened the wardrobe. Inside hung 2 gray work uniforms, a thin coat worn through at the collar, and a sweater. That was everything. At the bottom of the wardrobe stood 1 pair of work shoes and an old pair of sneakers, their soles worn heavily toward the left side. He closed the wardrobe. He stood in the middle of the room and looked around, and it took him a while to understand what was making him uncomfortable. Nothing there belonged to her. There wasn't a single photograph. No letters, no postcards, no ornament, no book, no bracelet resting inside a box, no movie ticket tucked beneath the mirror. There was nothing a person ordinarily gathered around themselves as proof that they had passed through this life. The room was as clean and empty as a rented room waiting for its next occupant, even though someone had lived there for 3 years. On the table sat a square tin box, the kind that once held holiday cookies and that people often kept afterward. Malachi opened it. Inside were documents arranged neatly and clipped together by month with colored paper clips. He lifted out the file on top. Medical service bills. Bayview Dialysis Center. Patient. Benjamin Pell. He continued turning the pages. The second file, then the third. They reached steadily backward through time, month after month, farther back than the 3 years she had worked inside that house. 3 treatments every week. Every page carried a number, and in the corner of each one, written in small, careful blue ink, were the amounts already paid and the amount still owed. The balance had never reached 0. At the bottom of the box was an envelope containing several other papers. A copy of Benjamin Pell's birth certificate, issued in Raleigh County, West Virginia, an application for medical assistance that had been denied and stamped in red, and a document from the West Virginia Child Welfare Agency naming 2 children who had been placed with a foster family in Fayette County, dated 19 years earlier. Malachi didn't read beyond that line. He folded the page and returned it to its place, and that was the only moment in this entire story when he chose not to know more. But he had already seen one number, her date of birth. Ruthie Pell was 27 years old. He sat down on the wooden chair in that 9-square-meter room, still holding the tin box, and inside his mind a list began to form, a list he didn't want to make but couldn't stop. He hadn't known her age until he read it on a paper inside her box. He didn't know where she came from. He didn't know she had a younger brother. He hadn't known that during the 3 years she had worked beneath his roof, 3 times every week, someone had lain inside a dialysis room at Bayview, and the person paying for those treatments was the woman who had stood in the dark hallway and told him that someone was asking questions about his car. He didn't know whether she had anyone in the world to call when something went wrong, and suddenly, he understood why no one had reported her missing during the previous 2 days. No parents, no friends, no neighbors, no one had telephoned to ask where she was. In a city of 600,000 people, a 27-year-old woman had vanished for 43 hours, and the only machinery powerful enough to search for her had been busy deciding that she was a thief. Malachi Drago placed the tin box back on the table, in the exact spot from which he had lifted it. He stood, and before leaving the room, he looked once more at the small plant on the windowsill. In that house, people called her that girl. In 3 years, he hadn't spoken her name even once. But she had watered the plant before leaving, as though she believed she would return. He turned off the light and climbed the stairs, and when he reached the 6th step, he stopped because a question had just entered his mind, and he couldn't understand why no one in his organization had asked it during the previous 2 days. Who had hired her to work in this house? The personnel records for the Drago estate were kept inside a steel cabinet in the 3rd-floor records room, and Malachi Drago went straight there shortly before 1 o'clock in the morning without waiting for daylight. This was the room August Fenn had forbidden Ruthie to enter. Malachi turned on the light. Steel filing cabinets stood in 2 rows along the walls, each drawer marked with a handwritten pencil label in Fenn's script. In a house where a person had to pass 3 rounds of screening before being allowed to work in the kitchen, the records of all 7 household employees occupied exactly 1 drawer. Malachi pulled it open and searched for the letter P. Ruthie Pell's file was so thin that he thought he had mistakenly picked up a folder of blank paper. It contained 3 pages. The first was a copy of her identification card, with a photograph taken 3 years earlier, showing a face younger and more exhausted than the one he had passed every morning. The second was a tax form. The third was an internal Drago Maritime hiring form, the kind used for office personnel, with 1 space for the reason for hiring and another for the approving signature. There was no job application, no resume, no name of a reference, no telephone number for a previous employer, no background check results, and no interview record. Malachi turned all 3 pages over twice, then pulled out the cook's file, followed by the gardener's and the driver's. Each one was at least 15 pages thick. Criminal record checks, verification of every residence during the previous 5 years, lists of relatives, notarized confidentiality agreements. Fenn's signature appeared on the final page, and beside it was a second signature from the head of security. In the home of a man whose name made half the city lower its voice, a woman had lived in the basement for 3 years, moved freely through every room, known the gate code, known his schedule, and even known where he kept his father's safe. Yet no one had ever made a single telephone call to ask who she was. He returned to the 3rd page and read the space-marked reason for hiring. Emergency replacement personnel. 3 words. No explanation of whom she was replacing and no reason why it had been urgent. Then he looked down at the approval box, and his hand stopped. There was only 1 signature, Marisol Vega. Malachi stood motionless in the records room for a long time, the paper still in his hand, and the sight of that name caused no disturbance inside him at all. That was the most frightening part. although it would take him several more days to understand why. Some names remained beside us for so long that the mind refused to connect them with suspicion. A person could stare directly at such a name and still let their eyes slide past it, as though it were merely another piece of furniture. Marisol Vega had made coffee for him during the nights when he studied the company ledgers at 22. She was the only person permitted to correct his signature on official documents without asking. For 7 years, every number that passed through Drago Maritime had first passed through her hands before reaching his. So when Malachi saw that signature, he didn't think of her. He thought of the system. Within the company, hiring records for office positions were approved by the accounting department, and Marisol gave the final signature. If someone wanted to place a person inside the estate without a security screening, the easiest method wasn't to forge documents. The easiest method was to use the wrong form. Submit a household worker under an office personnel form. Write the 3 words emergency replacement personnel in the reason box. Place it among a stack of 15 hiring forms on the final day of a financial quarter, and Marisol Vega would sign it along with the other 14 without lifting her head. In less than a minute, he had constructed the perfect defense for her, and he didn't even realize he had done it. Then he asked himself the next question. Who could have placed that form in the middle of the stack? Who managed all the personnel at the estate? Who held the keys to this records room? Who had stood in the security room doorway only recently, his hands clasped behind his back, saying in a voice filled with precisely the right amount of regret that he had suspected her for several weeks? Who had forbidden her from entering the 3rd floor 3 weeks earlier? Malachi folded the 3 pages, slipped them into the inside pocket of his coat, and turned off the light. He went down to the ground floor, stepped into the hallway, and stopped in the exact place where Ruthie Pell had waited for him 2 nights earlier with both hands clasped in front of her stomach. "Sir, someone asked me about you. Tell Fen." "I already did." Those 4 words returned to him, and this time he heard what had been hidden beneath them. She hadn't been telling him that she had followed the proper procedure. She had been saying that she had knocked on the only door she was permitted to knock upon, and that door had closed in her face. Then she had remained there a little longer without turning away, waiting for him to ask one more question, and he had told her to let Fen handle it. Malachi took out his telephone and called Saul, and when the other man answered, his voice was very quiet and very calm. The voice everyone who had worked with him long enough understood was more dangerous than any shout. "Tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock. Bring Fen into the library. Do I need to prepare anything? Bring me the 2 reports concerning last year's missing shipments, both incidents." At 7 o'clock in the morning, there were 2 men and 1 long wooden table inside the 1st floor library of the Drago estate. Malachi sat at the head of the table. Saul Briggs stood silently by the door, and he wouldn't speak once during the next 20 minutes. August, Fen entered with the task list in his hand, because 30 years of serving this family had taught him that a man should always carry something when entering his employer's presence. "You sent for me, sir. Sit down." Fen took his seat. He was 58 years old, his back straight, both hands resting neatly on the tabletop, and he had sat in that chair to deliver his reports thousands of times. Malachi said nothing for about 10 seconds. Then he placed 2 sheets of paper on the table and pushed them toward Fen. They were the 2 reports concerning missing shipments. In April of the previous year, a truck had been stopped on the road leading away from Pier 4. In September of that same year, a shipment had disappeared during the 40 minutes between the warehouse and the pier. Malachi had blamed both incidents on tighter customs inspections, and he had let both matters go because the losses weren't large enough to justify an investigation. Fen looked at the 2 pages. He didn't touch them. In April of last year, Malachi said, that truck's route was changed at the last moment. Only 3 people knew the new route: me, Saul, and the man who scheduled every vehicle for the household. The library was very quiet. Birds could be heard outside the window. In September, I changed the delivery time 2 hours in advance. I told Saul at 10 o'clock the previous night. You entered my study at 10:15 carrying a cup of tea I hadn't asked for. Fen's left hand slowly closed against the tabletop. Malachi didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. How long? There were moments when a man understood that every path had been blocked, and the only decision left was how he intended to leave. Fen had sat in that room for 30 years. He understood the rules better than the man questioning him. 2 years, he said. How much? 3,000 a month. Vehicle schedules, the times you left the house, and sometimes the names of guests who came to dinner. Who paid you? Coslow's people. I never met him. I met a man named Petrov in the parking lot behind the church on Charles Street. Fenn's voice remained even, almost relieved, with the relief of someone who had carried something for too long. My daughter is in Philadelphia. Her husband left. 3 children. I didn't ask you because I knew you'd give me the money, and then I'd owe you for the rest of my life. So you sold me. I sold vehicle schedules. I never sold a human being. Malachi allowed those words to rest on the table for a while. Then he asked the question he had been waiting to ask since 1 o'clock that morning. Ruthie Pell. And at that moment, something happened that Malachi hadn't expected. August Fenn's head snapped up. The blood drained from his face. The composure of a man who had accepted his fate vanished completely, replaced by genuine terror, the kind of fear no one could imitate after 30 years as a household steward. No. You forbade her from entering the 3rd floor. I kept her away from the 3rd floor because the personnel records were stored there, and there was something in those records I didn't want anyone to read. Fenn spoke rapidly, stumbling over his words as both hands began to tremble. She saw me open the back door twice. She reported me twice. I threatened to dismiss her. That's everything I did to her, sir. I swear on the lives of my 3 grandchildren. Did you ever offer her money? Fenn fell silent. Answer me. Yes. He looked down at the table. Twice. 500 the first time. 2,000 the second. And? She wouldn't take it. Malachi sat perfectly still. You know she needed money, Fenn said, and his voice broke in the middle of the sentence. Everyone in this house knew she needed money. She never bought anything for herself. Not one thing. Not in 3 years. I put $2,000 on the kitchen table, and I was certain she'd take it. She pushed it back toward me and said there was only one thing she asked of me, not to make her lie to you. The birds were still singing outside the window. In this house, Fenn said, she was the only person who wouldn't take anyone's money. I tried. I already tried. Malachi Drago raised a hand to his face and remained that way for a while. He had entered the room with a complete story inside his mind. The treacherous steward had placed someone in the house. That person had taken the safe, every piece fit, and all Malachi needed was a confession that would lead him to where Ruthie was being held. Now he had his confession. It led nowhere. Who brought her into this house? It wasn't me. Fenn shook his head. 3 years ago, I received an approved form from the company office, and a note telling me to arrange a room for her in the east basement. I thought you knew. I thought she was one of yours. One of mine? No one places a person inside your house without a background check, sir, unless someone very important approves it. I assumed you didn't want me asking questions. Malachi looked at Saul. Saul stepped forward and placed one hand on Fenn's shoulder, and the steward rose without resisting. At the door, he stopped for a moment. Sir, if she's still alive, please find her. She stood outside your door so many times. The door closed. Malachi remained alone in the library, with 2 reports concerning missing shipments, a story that had just collapsed, and no clues left at all. Ruthie Pell had been in the darkness for 51 hours. Yuri Kozlow ate lunch every day in the back room of a bakery on Eastern Avenue, and the entire city knew it because some men reached an age when allowing others to know exactly where they sat became a way of displaying power. Malachi Drago arrived at 12 o'clock noon. He came alone. He left his car 1 block away, left his telephone inside it, and when 2 of Koslow's men stopped him at the back entrance, he raised both hands to shoulder height and allowed them to search him without saying a word. Saul Briggs had argued against this for 40 minutes on the way there, and had finally fallen silent because he understood that his employer hadn't come to negotiate. The back room was small, with 3 tables, and only one of them was occupied. Koslow was 60 years old, his silver hair cut short, and he was halfway through a bowl of soup. He watched Malachi enter, looked at his empty hands, and set down his spoon. You didn't bring anyone. No. Then either you've come to kill me, or you're in very serious trouble. Koslow gestured toward the chair across from him. Sit. Malachi sat down. Your men were at Pier 4 twice last week. They were. Fenn sold my vehicle schedules to a man named Petrov for 2 years. Koslow didn't deny it. He wiped his mouth with a napkin, folded it, and placed it beside the bowl. Petrov works for me. Fenn received $3,000 a month. I know which roads you take, whom you dine with, and what time you leave your house. He shrugged. You also know who has lunch with me every Thursday. That's the work we do. If you've come because of that, you're wasting an afternoon. I came because of a woman. Kozlo looked up, and Malachi, who had sat across from every kind of man during the past 12 years, saw something on the old man's face that he hadn't been prepared for. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't mockery. It was attention. Your maid. You know her. I know her name. I've never met her. For the past 3 nights, a car with false license plates has been parked at the end of Blackthorn Street. It isn't mine. Kozlo said it calmly. If I wanted to take someone from your house, I wouldn't have needed to wait 3 nights, and I wouldn't have taken a maid. I'm 60 years old, Drago. I don't have time for foolish things anymore. Then prove it. Kozlo studied him for a long time. Then he reached beneath the table, opened a leather case resting near his feet, and removed a brown envelope. He placed it on the table between them but didn't release it yet. This reached me 19 days ago. It came through the mail with an ordinary stamp and was left in the mailbox of this bakery. There was no return address. He pushed the envelope toward Malachi. Inside were 11 sheets containing printed photographs. They had been taken with a telephone, slightly crooked and in weak light, with the corner of a table and the edge of the paper visible in the frame. The images showed pages of documents. Malachi turned through them one by one. Account opening records, 4 accounts bearing his name, 2 of which he had never seen in his life. Statements showing transfers between those accounts and a shell company registered in Delaware. A shipping contract listing a weight entirely different from the bill of lading for the shipment at Pier 9. And on the final sheet, a handwritten list of shipment numbers with dates beside them, stretching across 4 years. These were the pages that had been kept inside the safe, hidden in the recess of his study wall. Do you know what this is? I know it isn't my business. Kozlo pushed the soup away. I want your southern route, Drago. I've wanted it since before your father died. But I want to take it with money, or with my own men at the harbor. I don't want federal authorities entering the port of Baltimore. Once they come in, they don't distinguish between your ships and mine. He tapped one finger against the stack of papers. Whoever sent this to me wasn't trying to help me destroy you. That person was warning me that someone was setting a fire beneath the floorboards under both of us. Malachi gathered the 11 sheets, and as he returned them to the envelope, his eyes stopped on the back of it. A handwritten line appeared there. Small, careful blue ink, written in the same hand he had seen the previous night in the corners of the medical bills inside the tin box in the east basement. What did she write? Kozlo didn't answer. He only spoke very slowly. I've been looking for her for 3 weeks, too. Why do you think I sit here every day, eating lunch in this exact place at this exact time, where the whole city knows where to find me? He stood and picked up his coat. I was waiting for the person who sent that letter to return. She didn't, but you came. Kozlo walked toward the door, then stopped for a moment. She didn't ask me for money. She didn't ask for protection. She only sent me that and one name. No one in our line of work behaves that way, Drago. Only an outsider would. The door closed. Malachi sat alone in the back room of the bakery, turned the envelope beneath the light, and read the 4 words Ruthie Pell had written on the back. Ask Marisol Vega. Malachi Drago sat inside his car for 20 minutes without starting the engine. The 4 words on the back of the envelope didn't surprise him. That was the strangest part. They simply remained there, and everything from the previous 3 days began sliding into its proper place with a smoothness that made him feel sick. Who had approved the personnel file that brought Ruthie Pell into that house 3 years earlier, signing it alone without a background check? Who had prepared the documents for the shipment at Pier 9, the documents whose declared weight didn't match the bill of lading, opening the door for the port police to enter? Who had suggested 7 years earlier that the original copies of important documents should be stored inside a safe at his private residence instead of at the office, because the office would be the first place investigators searched? Who had read him an inventory of the safe's contents without mentioning the 4 sets of account opening documents? Who had sat in the chair across from him 2 days earlier with 2 cups of coffee and told him, in a voice as gentle as someone loosening a tangled thread, not to worry about the accounting records? He returned to the Fells Point office at 3 o'clock that afternoon, called the attorney and Saul into the room, locked the door, and spread Kozlo's 11 pages across the desk beside the 3 documents taken from the safe. The attorney needed 40 minutes to reconstruct the entire scheme. 4 accounts bearing Malachi Drago's name, 2 of which he had never opened, had been established with documents carrying expertly forged signatures. Money flowed in from a shell company in Delaware, flowed out again, passed through 3 layers, and returned disguised as legitimate shipping revenue belonging to Drago Maritime. 4 years. The amount was so large that the attorney had to read the figure twice. "This isn't theft," he said. "When people steal, they withdraw the money and disappear. This is building a house and putting your name on the deed." "Why?" "So when the federal authorities arrive, they find dirty money flowing through accounts in your name, with your signature on every page, stored inside a safe in your private residence." The attorney looked up. "Meanwhile, the person who actually controlled the money is only a salaried chief accountant who will testify that she was simply following instructions." Saul Briggs, who had stood beside Malachi for 12 years and had never spoken an unnecessary word, placed both hands on the desk. 7 years, he said. "She sat in this room for 7 years. Malachi said nothing. His mind wasn't on the amount of money. It wasn't on the 4 accounts, the company in Delaware, or the trial that was coming. He was thinking about an evening 12 years earlier, when he was 22 years old. His father had been dead for 3 months, and he sat before a stack of ledgers without understanding a single line. Someone knocked, entered, placed a cup of coffee on the desk, pulled up a chair beside him, and told him to begin again from the first page. They sat there until 4 o'clock in the morning. The next morning, she returned with another cup of coffee. 7 years as chief accountant, 12 years in that room. Malachi had believed that when the truth finally came, he would feel anger. But anger was something he already knew. He had lived with it all his life. What came to him that afternoon was something entirely different, like missing a step in the darkness. That instant when the ground wasn't where his foot believed it should be. He wasn't shocked by the conspiracy. He was shocked by the face behind it. "And Miss Pell?" the attorney said. "I don't understand her role." Malachi understood then, completely and all at once, and he had to rise and walk to the window so that no one in the room would see his face. Ruthie had seen something on the 3rd floor. She had reported it to Fenn twice, and both times she had been stopped because Fenn was busy hiding his own crime. She had no one to call. She was a maid without a name in that house, and had she gone to Malachi, he would have asked where her proof was, and her proof would have been nothing more than the word of a woman whose employer had never once spoken her name. So she had searched for it herself. She had photographed the papers inside the safe. 11 pictures taken with a telephone in dim light, with the corner of a table visible in the frame. She had sent them to Yuri Kozlow, the only man in the city powerful enough not to be bought by Marisol and selfish enough to be forced into action by his own interests. Then she had found herself facing a problem no 27-year-old maid should ever have been forced to confront. Photographs weren't evidence. In court, pictures taken with a telephone could be dismissed in 3 minutes. What mattered were the originals, with real ink, with raised notarized seals that could be touched, documents a handwriting expert could hold and say that the pen had been lifted during the final stroke of this Drago signature. And the originals were inside a steel safe that Marisol Vega would have removed during the night if she had suspected for even 1 second, leaving nothing behind by morning to prove what had happened. So at 4:17 in the morning, Ruthie Pell carried 15 kilograms of steel through the gates. She had no car. No one was waiting for her. She walked with a limp, holding the safe against her chest. And after about 4 blocks, she realized there were footsteps behind her, or headlights that had turned after her for the 2nd time. She had 3 seconds to decide. She didn't run because she couldn't. She pulled a trash container into the alley behind the laundromat, lowered the safe to the bottom, covered it beneath 4 layers of garbage bags, choosing a place close enough to the estate that Drago's men would certainly find it, and hidden enough that whoever was following her wouldn't think to look there. Then she stood, empty-handed, and kept walking. Malachi turned away from the window. "She didn't kill her," he said. "She took her because she needs to know who received the copies." Ruthie Pell had been in the darkness for 63 hours. Saul Briggs didn't go looking for Marisol Vega. He went looking for documents, and that was the only correct decision left to make that afternoon. The shell company in Delaware was called Hallwater Logistics, and the attorney needed 40 minutes to uncover the list of assets registered under its name. Most of them were invisible things: bank accounts, brokerage licenses, a post office box in Wilmington. But on the 9th line was something real, something that occupied physical space on the earth. A long-term lease on a refrigerated warehouse at Dundalk Marine Terminal, signed 2 years earlier, paid quarterly, and never once interrupted. The refrigerated warehouse had ceased operating the year before. There was no electricity, no merchandise, no one. "Why rent a warehouse no one uses?" the attorney asked. Saul had already picked up his coat before the question was finished. They left at 7 o'clock that evening. 4 vehicles, 11 men, no sirens, no lights. Dundalk lay southeast of the city, a vast stretch of concrete running along the waterfront, where long rows of gray warehouses stood beneath sparse, high-pressure lights. Section C was at the far end, close to the water, and when the convoy shut off its engines 300 meters away, not one of them said a word. 2 men stood at the entrance to the row beside a vehicle, with no license plates. Saul went first. What followed happened quickly and cleanly, in the way such matters were handled by men who had done them many times before. There were no gunshots. No one had time to cry out. In less than 20 seconds, both guards were lying face down on the concrete with their hands secured behind their backs, and one of them had already begun to talk. Malachi walked over and crouched in front of him. Which warehouse? I don't know. I was only told to stand here. Who told you? A woman. I don't know her name. She paid in cash. When was the last time she came here? The man hesitated, and that hesitation was the worst answer of all the answers he could have given. Yesterday, in the morning. Malachi stood. Section C contained 14 warehouses. They formed one long row beside the water, each separated from the next by about 20 meters. Their rolling steel doors rusted and their concrete walls stained with salt. The numbers had been painted in white at the upper left corner of each door, and most had peeled so badly that they could only be read by standing directly beneath them. No one knew which warehouse it was. They spread out. Malachi didn't wait. He began running along the row with a flashlight in his hand, reading each number as he passed. 11. The door stood wide open, the interior empty and filled with trash and dry leaves blown in from the sea. 10. The lock had been cut long ago, rusted through and clinging to the hinge. 9. The rolling door was broken and held in place by a wooden board. He ran. In 12 years, Malachi Drago had never once run in front of his men. People feared him because he never hurried, never raised his voice, and never allowed anyone to see that anything in this world could reach him. That night, 11 men watched him run along the harbor like an ordinary human being, and none of them ever spoke of it afterward. 8. The rolling door was secured with its original lock and covered in a thick layer of dust. He stopped. Dust. He swept the flashlight across the concrete in front of the door, then moved the beam farther along the ground, and he saw them. Tire tracks. A vehicle had parked there. And not only once. The layer of salt dust across the concrete had been ground into 2 parallel lines, and they led toward the next door, the final warehouse in the row. Malachi approached it, slowing down, and the beam of his flashlight stopped at the upper left corner. The white paint there hadn't peeled like the others. Someone had repainted it recently, using a thin and clumsy layer to cover the old number beneath it. 7. The padlock hanging between the 2 steel doors was new. Bright steel, without a trace of rust, completely out of place among the entire row of abandoned warehouses. No one placed a new lock on a door with nothing behind it. Behind him, the sound of Saul and the others running toward him began to fade from his ears until he couldn't hear anything at all. He stood before that door, and in that moment, everything he was fell away from him. There was no longer the ruler of Baltimore Harbor, no longer the man whose name made the entire city lower its voice. There was only someone who had failed to ask one question in a dark hallway, someone who had nodded twice at 2 lies, someone who had sat in conference rooms for 63 hours telling himself that she was a thief. Inside, there was complete silence. Malachi Drago drew in a breath, and he realized that his hand was trembling. Then he raised that hand, placed it against the cold steel of the Warehouse 7 door, and what happened next, you already know. The University of Maryland Medical Center had a row of intensive care rooms on the 4th floor, and for 9 days, Malachi Drago memorized every tile in the hallway outside room 412. Dr. Naomi Hart was the physician in charge. She had told him everything that needed to be said on the first night, in the emergency parking lot, while the smell of the sea still clung to his coat. Prolonged hypothermia, severe dehydration. Her body had remained in a state of self-preservation for too long. She was alive, and she had survived because of herself, not because of anyone else. Then the doctor said the words he would carry for the rest of his life. The words about one day, about 26 hours, and he remained leaning against the side of his car in that parking lot long after she had gone back inside. Ruthie didn't wake on the first day. She didn't wake on the second. Malachi stayed. He moved his meetings into a waiting room on the 3rd floor. His attorney brought documents for him to sign while he sat in the plastic chair outside her room. Saul stood at the far end of the hallway for 18 hours each day, and no one had asked him to do it. 3 times, a nurse reminded Malachi that visiting hours were over, and all 3 times, he nodded, thanked her, and sat down again. On the 2nd day, he asked someone from the hospital's financial department to come upstairs. Transfer every expense for Miss Pell to me. No limit. Yes, sir. We also found another patient in our system with the same contact address, Benjamin Pell, currently receiving treatment at the Bayview Center. His expenses too. All of them, including everything already owed. The woman from the financial department looked at the figure on the screen, then looked at him, and asked nothing else. Benny arrived on the afternoon of the 3rd day. He was 19 years old, tall and thin, with brown hair like his sister's. He entered the 4th floor hallway with a backpack hanging from one shoulder and stopped outside room 412, looking through the glass panel for a long time. Then he turned toward the man sitting in the chair beside the door. "You're Malachi Drago." "Yes." Benny nodded. He didn't sit down. He stood with his back straight, both hands gripping the strap of his backpack, and looked at Malachi with a calmness that unsettled him more deeply than any accusation could have. "They told me you paid all my medical bills." "Yes." "Going back 4 years." "Yes." "Why?" Malachi had prepared himself for that question, and he realized that every answer he had prepared was really about himself, because no one should have had to carry that alone. Benny watched him for another moment. Then he set his backpack on the floor, sat in the chair across from him, and rested both elbows on his knees. "My sister called me every Tuesday night," he said. "For 3 years. Last Tuesday night, she didn't call. I tried calling her back, but I couldn't reach her. I called the estate, and an older man answered and told me that my sister had quit her job." Malachi said nothing. "I'm 19, and I don't have a car." Benny continued in the same calm voice. "I have dialysis 3 times a week. I called the police station in the Eastern District, and they asked how old my sister was, whether she had a history of disappearing, whether she owed anyone money. I answered every question. They wrote it down and said they would contact me." He paused. No one did. Beyond the hallway windows, the sky had begun to darken. "I didn't come here to blame you," Benny said. "I know who you are. Everyone in this city knows who you are. If you hadn't found my sister, there wouldn't have been anything I could do to you anyway. You have every right to blame me. I only want to ask you one question." He looked up. "My sister worked in your house for 3 years. Did you ever speak to her?" Malachi Drago had sat across from federal prosecutors. He had sat in the back room of a bakery with a man who had wanted his shipping route for 20 years. He had answered questions where one wrong response could have cost him everything. But sitting there on a plastic chair in a 4th-floor hospital hallway, he couldn't find a single word. He thought of 4 words. That girl, close the window. He thought of the only question he had ever asked about her work, spoken near midnight 3 days before she disappeared. He thought of his answer. "All right." Benny waited. He wasn't waiting to corner him. He was truly waiting, as though there were still a chance the answer might be yes. "No," Malachi said. "Not once." Benny nodded slowly. He said nothing more. He bent down, picked up his backpack, stood, and entered the room to sit beside his sister's bed. That night, Malachi drove back to Roland Park shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning. He went straight down to the east basement, opened the 4th door, and turned on the light. He lifted the small potted plant from the windowsill. The soil was still slightly damp because someone had been coming down to water it during the past 9 days, and he didn't ask who. He also picked up the tin box from the table. At 4 o'clock in the morning, he returned to the 4th floor. He placed the plant on the windowsill of room 412, exactly where the first light of dawn would reach it. He set the tin box beside it, its edge parallel to the edge of the sill, exactly 1 hand's breadth away, exactly the way she had arranged everything for 3 years without him ever noticing. Then he sat down in the chair beside her bed and waited. Ruthie Pell opened her eyes on the morning of the 9th day at 7:20, and the first thing she looked at wasn't the man sitting beside her bed. She looked toward the window. The early sunlight was falling across the sill at an angle, touching the exact place where he had set the little plant 5 days earlier, and her eyes rested there for a very long time. Malachi didn't dare move. He had imagined this moment many times during those 9 days, and in every version of it, he had believed she would cry, or become frightened, or turn her face away. She only looked at the plant. Then she turned her head very slowly and looked at him. "Good morning, sir." 3 words. There was nothing in them. No anger, no accusation, not even surprise. She spoke to him in the same voice she had always used when bringing in his coffee at 9 o'clock in the morning, and Malachi Drago realized that he would have preferred her to scream in his face. "Good morning. How long have I been here, sir?" 9 days. She absorbed the number without any visible reaction. Dr. Hart came in 15 minutes later, and for the first half hour, everything proceeded normally. Ruthie knew her own name. She knew her brother's name. She remembered the last foster grandmother who had cared for her in Fayette County. She knew where she worked. She gave her date of birth correctly, and she could name the doctor treating Benny at Bayview. Then Dr. Hart asked about that night. Ruthie fell silent. "Do you remember leaving the house?" "Yes, ma'am. It was still dark. I walked out through the gate." "What were you carrying?" A long silence followed. "Something heavy," she said. I held it against my chest. My arms were tired. "What happened after that?" She looked down at her hands resting on the blanket. Her wrists were still wrapped in bandages. "I don't know, ma'am." Dr. Hart continued for another 10 minutes, using the gentle, indirect questions she had asked hundreds of patients before, and in the end, she called Malachi out into the hallway. "She hasn't lost her memory," the doctor said. "Her long-term memory is intact. The problem lies within the 3 weeks before she was admitted, especially the final days. A brain exposed to prolonged hypothermia can't store new memories reliably. Some fragments remain. Others may never have been recorded at all. Will they come back? Perhaps. Some of them may. Perhaps none will." She looked at him. "And I need to make this very clear, sir. You mustn't pressure her. If you sit beside her and force her to remember, you'll only make her afraid of her own mind. Memories like these return in their own way, not ours." The attorney arrived that afternoon. He sat in the 3rd-floor waiting room, opened his case, and placed a document bearing the seal of the United States District Court for the District of Maryland on the table. "The preliminary hearing is in 11 days. What do they have?" 4 accounts in your name, 4 years of financial transactions, and a cooperating witness has submitted a voluntary statement." The attorney spoke the next name very slowly. "Marisol Vega." Malachi said nothing. "She claims that every transaction was carried out under your direct instructions. She submitted work schedules, meeting records, and copies of documents bearing your signature." The attorney looked up. "She's still reporting to work as usual in Fells Point, sir. She approved the payroll this morning." "Why hasn't she run?" "Because she doesn't need to. According to the current record, she's only a chief accountant who followed orders. If she runs, she becomes the architect of the scheme. She has to appear at that hearing, sir. Her entire story depends on her sitting in the witness chair." "What do we have?" The attorney exhaled. "We have the originals of the 4 account opening files, and a handwriting expert who can testify that the signatures were forged. But the prosecution will argue that you forged your own signatures to escape responsibility. We have 11 photographs taken with a telephone and sent to Mr. Coslow, but they have no legal value. And we have a maid who has just awakened after 9 days unconscious and can't remember the final 3 weeks." He tapped one finger against the table. "We need whatever is on that hard drive." The small black hard drive, no larger than a pack of cigarettes, had remained inside Malachi's desk drawer for 9 days. The technical team had worked on it for 4 consecutive days, and they had told him the same thing 3 times. Military-grade encryption. No backdoor. 10 incorrect attempts would destroy the data. They had already used 6. At 7 o'clock that evening, he returned to room 412. Ruthie was sitting upright against the pillows. Benny had just left. On the windowsill, the little plant caught the last of the fading sunlight. Malachi pulled a chair closer, sat down, and placed the hard drive on the small table beside the bed. Ruthie looked at it. Something crossed her face then, so quickly that it was almost gone before he could recognize it. A brief tightening around her eyes, like someone hearing their name called from the far side of a crowded room. Then it disappeared. "Do you recognize it?" "I think I do, sir." She reached out and touched the black plastic casing, then drew her hand back. "I remember holding it, in the dark. I remember being afraid. There's something inside it that can save both of us. You changed the password so that person couldn't open it." "Which person, sir?" He didn't answer. "Do you remember what you chose as the password?" Ruthie sat perfectly still. She looked at the hard drive, then toward the window, then down at her hands. Malachi watched her struggle, and he saw the moment she reached a smooth wall with nothing to hold on to. "I know I chose something important," she said softly. "I remember thinking, while I typed it, that no one would ever guess it." She looked up, and for the first time in 9 days, something inside her eyes broke apart, but I can't remember what it was. For the next 3 days, no one asked Ruthie Pell a single question about the password. The attorney suggested bringing in a forensic psychologist. The technical team suggested trying a structured memory retrieval method. Malachi refused both. He remembered what Dr. Hart had told him in the hallway, that if he sat there and forced Ruthie to remember, he would only make her afraid of her own mind. But on the evening of the 3rd day, after Benny had gone home and half the hallway lights had been dimmed, Malachi pulled his chair a little closer to the bed and sat down. Ruthie was looking out the window. Outside, the sky was heavy with clouds, low leaden clouds that belonged to an April evening in Baltimore. "I didn't come to ask you anything," he said. "Yes, sir. I came to tell you something." She turned to look at him, slightly surprised. Malachi rested both elbows on his knees, lowered his eyes toward the floor, and began speaking in the slow, quiet voice the entire city had learned to fear. "You roasted the coffee again from the previous afternoon. You never let it sit longer than 1 day. You poured it into the cup and waited exactly 4 minutes for it to cool, because if it was too hot, I would set it down to read my mail and forget it was there." Ruthie said nothing. "You placed it at the corner of the table on my right, exactly 1 hand's breadth from the edge. 3 years, and it was never out of place once." He paused. "Beside the coffee there was always a glass of water and a pill for my stomach. I never asked why it was there, but I took it every morning for 3 years, and during the past 9 days, I haven't taken a single one, because I don't know where they're kept in the house." A very small sound came from the bed. He didn't look up. "My coat hung from the stair post instead of inside the closet. I always thought it was because the cleaning staff was lazy. It wasn't until last week that I remembered a morning in November when I arrived 15 minutes late to a meeting because I couldn't find it, and from the next day onward, it was always hanging from the stair post." He pressed his thumb into his palm once. "You knocked twice, with exactly 1 beat between the sounds. No one else in the house knocked that way. Fen knocked 3 times quickly. The kitchen staff knocked once, and opened the door immediately. I could tell it was you from inside the room, apart from every one of them, and I never realized I could." "Sir, I haven't finished." He lifted his head and looked directly at her for the first time during the conversation. "You sang while you polished the stair railing. Very softly. There were no words, only a melody. I listened to you sing that song for 3 years, and I don't know its name, but if someone played it now, I would recognize it immediately." Ruthie raised one hand to cover her mouth. "You closed the second-floor windows before it rained. Not when it started raining, but before. Once, I stood in the study and watched you walk down the hallway, closing them one by one while the sun was still shining outside. I thought you were doing useless work. 40 minutes later, it began to rain." He stopped. 3 years. That girl. I called you that girl for 3 years. Outside, the leaden clouds finally broke, and the first drops of rain began to touch the glass. "I thought I hadn't seen you," Malachi said, "but it turns out I saw everything. I simply never allowed myself to name what I was seeing. That's much worse." Ruthie began to cry. It wasn't the kind of crying he had seen from others. There were no sobs and no trembling shoulders. Her tears simply ran down her face, steady and silent, like something that had been held back for too long and had finally found a narrow opening through which to escape. During 3 years in that house, she had learned not to make a sound even when she cried. Malachi took out his handkerchief and offered it to her. She accepted it, and for a moment, her hand touched his. "No one has ever noticed any of those things," she said. "I didn't notice them either. I only remembered." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I owe it to you," he said. "And because I want you to know that those 3 years didn't disappear into nothing. They're inside the mind of a man who was too foolish to say so until it was almost too late." He stood, pushed the chair back, and reached for his coat. Ruthie remained still, the handkerchief resting in her palm, her eyes turned toward the window where the rain was now running down the glass in streams. Malachi walked to the door. He placed one hand on the knob, then stopped and looked back. "Good night, Ruthie." It was the second time in his life that he had spoken her name. The first had been in the darkness of Warehouse 7, when she hadn't heard him. This time, She did. And something happened inside that room. Something Dr. Hart would later explain using clinical words about the hippocampus and memory cues. But in that moment, it didn't feel like science at all. Ruthie Pell's head snapped up. Her eyes opened wide, not looking at him but through him, and the hand holding the handkerchief tightened. She was sitting in darkness. She was holding a hard drive in her lap, her fingers trembling over a keyboard, and she had less than 1 minute. She needed a sequence of numbers. Not her own date of birth, because anyone could find that within 2 minutes. Not Benny's date of birth. Not anything connected to her, because everything that belonged to her was contained in a 3-page personnel file approved by the woman behind it all. She needed a number that woman would never think of. She needed a number that no one in that entire organization had remembered, not once, in 7 years. Mr. Drago. Her voice was hoarse. I remember now. Malachi returned to the bedside and placed the hard drive in her hands along with the attorney's laptop. There are 4 attempts left, he said. If the 10th one is wrong, the data will destroy itself. I know. I said it that way. Ruthie rested the computer on her lap. Her wrists were still wrapped in bandages, and her fingers trembled when they touched the keyboard. But she didn't hesitate for even a second. May I ask you one question, sir? Go ahead. When were you born? Malachi Drago stood frozen beside the hospital bed. February 19th, he said. 1982. She typed 8 digits. She pressed the key. The screen went dark for 1 beat. Then the encryption window disappeared, and a folder opened. 327 files. Ruthie lowered the computer onto the blanket, leaned back against the pillows, and closed her eyes. She was too exhausted to speak. Malachi stood there staring at the screen, and it took him a long time to ask the question he needed to ask. Why did you choose my birthday? She opened her eyes. Because I was sitting in the dark, and I had less than a minute, she said. I needed a number she would never think of. Then I remembered that on February 19th, not one person in that company sent you a single word. No flowers, no card, not one telephone call. 700 people work for you, and no one remembered. I thought that if all 700 of them had forgotten, then she would have forgotten too. Malachi said nothing. I left a small cake on the kitchen table that morning. Ruthie said softly. You walked past it without seeing it. I cleared it away that afternoon. The 327 files included parallel accounting spreadsheets, emails, screenshots from the money transfer system, and a subfolder named Delaware, containing every document used to establish Hallwater Logistics, bearing the real signature of its founder. The technical team worked through the night. The attorney called the Department of Justice at 6 o'clock in the morning. The preliminary hearing took place 8 days later, at the United States District Court for the District of Maryland on Lombard Street. Marisol Vega arrived at 8:45. She wore a gray suit, her hair tied neatly back, and carried a slim leather case. She entered the courtroom with the composed bearing of someone who had come to assist the law. She had to be there. The story she had spent 4 years constructing could stand only if she sat in the witness chair and testified that she had merely followed orders. If she ran, she would lose everything. She had calculated that carefully, just as she had calculated everything else. She sat in the second row. She opened her case, removed a stack of documents, and arranged them neatly. She didn't know that at 6 o'clock the previous morning, all 327 files had been submitted to the Department of Justice, together with the 4 original account opening files and the handwriting examination report. At 9 o'clock precisely, the judge entered the courtroom. The hearing lasted 11 minutes. The federal prosecutor rose and announced that, because of newly submitted evidence, the government was withdrawing every charge against Malachi Drago connected to the 4 accounts named in the case. Then, in the same even voice, he added that an arrest warrant had been issued that morning. 2 federal agents moved forward from the rear of the courtroom toward the second row. Malachi sat less than 6 meters away. He had prepared for this moment for 8 days. He had imagined dozens of things he might say, words as sharp as knives that a man in his position had every right to speak to someone who had tried to destroy him. In the end, he said nothing. Marisol Vega stood when the agents reached her. She didn't resist. She didn't even appear surprised. And that was perhaps the most frightening detail of all because it showed that she had calculated this possibility too. She had simply believed the odds were very low. She turned her head and looked at him. For 12 years, Malachi had looked upon that face across thousands of mornings. It was the face of the woman who had pulled up a chair beside him when he was 22, and told him to begin again from the first page. She spoke first. "Do you know why I put her in your house?" Malachi didn't answer. "Because she was the safest person I could find," Marisol said. "No family, no friends. A gravely ill brother who meant she would never dare lose her job. No one in this world would search for her if she disappeared." She tilted her head slightly. "I needed someone inside that house to make sure no one touched the safe. I chose the most invisible person I could find." One of the federal agents touched her elbow. "I calculated everything correctly, Malachi. 4 years. Every number." Her voice didn't tremble. "I miscalculated only one thing. I thought someone with nothing to lose would never dare to risk losing anything at all." They led her down the aisle. At the door, she stopped one last time and spoke the words Malachi Drago would hear again in his mind on many nights afterward. "You walked past her for 3 years. I watched her for 3 years. And in the end, neither of us understood who she was." The courtroom door closed. Autumn came early to Baltimore that year, and on a clear October morning, the inner harbor was filled with sunlight and the sound of people. 6 months had passed since the courtroom door closed. Drago Maritime was now a different company. Malachi had withdrawn completely from the southern shipping route. The prize 2 families had fought over for 20 years, and he had stepped away not because he had lost, but because he had spent a very long time sitting in a hospital hallway and reconsidering what that route was truly worth. Every set of accounts was now independently audited each quarter. Everyone working for the company and inside the house in Roland Park had a written contract, health insurance, and a full name beside a photograph on the personnel roster. On the wall of the first-floor hallway at the Fells Point office hung a small sign displaying the number of an anonymous reporting hotline that led directly outside the company to an independent law office without passing through anyone in the organization. People asked him why he had created that line. He answered that once, someone had knocked on the only door she was permitted to knock upon, and that door had closed in her face. That morning, Malachi stood in the plaza on the western side of the harbor and saw Ruthie Pell approaching from Pratt Street. She walked differently now. The slight uneven rhythm in her left leg was still there and would remain with her for the rest of her life, but she no longer kept close to the wall. She walked down the middle of the path with her head raised and a folder held in her arms. She handed it to him. The first page contained a proposal for a fund that would help domestic workers in Baltimore and their families pay medical expenses. Beneath it was a list of partners who had already committed their support: 3 hospitals, 2 labor unions, and 1 city charitable organization. On the final page, beneath the words Executive Director, was her name. "Did you do all of this by yourself?" "I worked on it for 6 months in the waiting room at Bayview," she said. "I had a great deal of time to sit there." "What is the fund called?" "The Pell Fund." Malachi turned back to the first page and read it again. "You named it after yourself." "Not only me," Ruthie said. "It's Benny's name too." Benny had received a kidney transplant in July. The surgery lasted 7 hours, and Malachi had remained in the hospital hallway for every one of those hours, not because anyone had asked him to, but because during those 9 days in the spring, he had learned that simply being present was the one thing money couldn't do in a person's place. Benny was now 19 and a half, had returned to school, and that morning he was standing at the far corner of the plaza, helping people carry tables. The opening ceremony began at 10 o'clock. There was sunshine and wind rising from the water, and several rows of plastic chairs arranged somewhat unevenly across the brick pavement. There were cakes and lemonade on a long table covered with a paper cloth. More than 100 people attended, most of them women and men who cleaned houses, cooked meals, and cared for elderly people in homes throughout the city. People whose names never appeared anywhere. They came with their families. Children ran around the plaza laughing, chasing one another between the rows of chairs, and no one bothered to tell them to sit down. Ruthie stood to speak. She said exactly 4 sentences, holding the page in both hands. Malachi remained behind her. He didn't step onto the platform, and when she finished, he simply applauded with everyone else. After most of the gathering had ended, she walked over to where he stood beside the railing, looking out across the water. "Thank you for coming. I didn't do anything. You did." She remained silent for a moment, watching 2 children run past. "Do you remember what you asked me in the hospital?" she said. "You asked why I chose your birthday." "I remember. At the time, I said it was because no one remembered. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." She turned and looked at him. "The truth is that during the 3 years I worked in that house, I always believed that if I disappeared one day, no one would come looking for me. And that night, when I sat in the darkness and had to choose a number, I chose the number belonging to the man I believed no one remembered either. I thought we were alike. The wind moved across the water. But you came looking for me, she said. Late, but you came. One day late. Yes, one day. She didn't deny it, and he was grateful that she didn't. But you came. She held out her hand. Thank you, Malachi. It was the first time she had spoken his name. He took her hand, and in that moment, the man whose name had once made the entire city of Baltimore lower its voice understood something that no contract, no peer, and no year of power had ever taught him. A person's worth isn't determined by where they stand inside your house. The most invisible person is often the one keeping everything from falling apart, and you notice it only when that person is no longer there. Some people go through their entire lives without asking anyone for anything, not because they have no needs, but because they have grown accustomed to their requests going unheard. And the greatest kindness one person can give another isn't money or protection. It is simply knowing their name, looking directly into their eyes, and noticing immediately when they are gone. Loyalty can't exist where people aren't safe, and no one should have to disappear before someone finally sees them. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button and subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing more meaningful stories with you every day. And please share this video with anyone you believe may need to hear it today. We would truly love to know how you feel about the story of Ruthie and Malachi, so please leave a comment below and tell us what you felt deep within your heart, because we sincerely value and read every message you share. We wish you and your family abundant health, happiness, and peace in every day of your lives. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next video.